Thank you, Jourdan, and thank you to Concurrences for inviting me to this event, which was particularly timely because it came 2 days after the judgment of the Court of Justice in the Illumina Grill judgment. This is a very important judgment, obviously, because it puts an end to the Commission policy of using Article 22 to review and call in mergers referred to by national competition authorities when those mergers don't meet national thresholds. I see this case primarily as a constitutional judgment. It's a judgment about the institutional balance, and in particular, the end of the judgment is the most important, where the court says that the Commission has been using Article 22 for a purpose which was not the original purpose, which is not why Article 22 was introduced. And I find it particularly important that the court reaches this conclusion and calls the Commission when it is using the regulation for a purpose that is not the one that was intended. The court also makes some interesting remarks about the economy of the EU merger regulation in the case, in particular around paragraphs 204 to 209, where the court underlines that the choice that the legislator made when the EU regulation was adopted was one where legal certainty and predictability was taken into account very much, in particular around the choice of turnover thresholds. Right? And I think what the court was sensitive to in this case is the fact that the Commission's choice here of using Article 22 the way it used it upset that choice of the legislator. And essentially the court ends up saying that if the Commission wants to change that, there's a procedure for that. It has to make a proposal, and then the legislator has to decide whether or not that balance between efficiency and predictability has to be changed. And so I think this is a very important judgment and welcome judgment from our perspective. Now, the court doesn't say anything about whether or not normatively calling powers are good or bad. I think this was also an interesting point in our discussion today, where we saw the Finnish regulator through SANA advocate very strongly in favor of having calling powers. And I gave the example of Norway, where the authority has the calling powers and has used it in a case where my company Schibsted was involved to call in a transaction and then prohibit it. Ultimately, this was the Schibsted net bill case, and Schibsted appealed this prohibition, and the prohibition was overturned by the Court of Appeal and ultimately overturned by the Supreme Court. That's to this day the first and still the only case that the Supreme Court in Norway, the merger case that the Supreme Court in Norway reviewed. And the conclusion of the Court of Appeal and the Norwegian Supreme Court was that essentially Netbill, which was acquired by Schibsted, offered a service that was not competing with Schibsted's service. And so at the end of the day, we went through a process where we acquired a startup that essentially had a complementary product, a product that fitted well with the Schibsted platforms and which we could have developed further during the 3 years, but were prevented of doing so. And somehow it's a bit ironic that the Norwegian Competition Authority intervened in that case in the name of innovation, but that their decision ended up, in essence, to slow innovation in Norway. And I'm not saying that case should rule out calling powers at national level. I think that's a choice that every country is free to make. But I'm saying is these powers have to be used constructively and with restraint, in particular in the digital sector, where the temptation is high today to over-enforce, I think. And the last point I would make is when authorities get those powers, I think there should be procedural safeguards, and they should only be able to call in mergers for a few months after the merger. And what we heard today from the Lithuanian Competition Authority, when they have this power for 12 months, I think this is incompatible with legal certainty and predictability that the Court of Justice underlined in the Illumina Grill judgment. So a shorter period, like 3 months in Norway, I think is a better choice.